Good morning and welcome to Red Arrow Ministries midweek devotions. My name is Ben. It is October 27th. Sorry this is a day late. Our 6-year-old son was sick on Tuesday. I stayed home and worked from home. Of course he got me sick, so yesterday I woke up with a pretty nasty cold, but feeling better. Sorry this is a day late. We are studying the book of Mark, chapter 2. We're going to pick it up on verse 23. Remember, Jesus has started his public ministry. He's been calling people into a greater understanding of who he is, specifically to disciples. He's been reaching out to people that are outside of the faith, people that the religious leaders of the day felt were not worth his time. And yet, here he is having meals with them, calling them to be his disciples. So, pick up the story at verse 23, where we see the heading, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. And so the idea of Sabbath is that we see in creation there's a rhythm of existence where God created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day, the Sabbath, he rested. Not because God had to rest, it wasn't like he was tired. God does not get tired. But he did that for us so that we would see that we're not designed to keep working, which is why he gave God's people the Sabbath, where they wouldn't work. And so the religious leaders of the day missed the true intent of Sabbath, finding rest from labors and instead finding rest in the Lord. And they got really legalistic, where to the point where they would get offended if people did things that they felt were breaking of the Sabbath. And so they were missing the point. And so Jesus, again, is trying to bring back a true and right understanding of what the Sabbath is. So verse 23, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. Remember, Jesus doesn't have a traditional synagogue where he lives in one city and his needs are provided. They're sort of traveling throughout the land preaching the good news. And so they got hungry and they were walking along and picked some heads of grain. The Pharisees, these religious leaders, said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Again, if you're hungry and there's food, you eat. And yet the Pharisees were looking for areas to trip Jesus up, to point out that he was doing things wrong. And here's what Jesus answered. "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only to priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Now, a couple illustrations in that one story highlight who Jesus is. Again, it gives a glimpse into his true identity. First of all, Jesus is the descendant of King David. And when King David was on the throne, he was promised by God that there would always be a descendant of David on the throne. And actually point to the Messiah, the true king of all heaven and earth, coming from his line. And so by bringing a story of King David up, Jesus is saying, hey, he's my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Secondly, David was an anointed king. And the current king, King Saul, was so angry with David that the Lord had chosen him over Saul and his son Jonathan, that he was chasing David around, trying to kill him. And it was then this time that David was sort of wandering, that he and his soldiers, his friends, were hungry, and they did things that normally would be considered wrong, but yet it was okay for David because David was God's anointed king. Just like Jesus, remember at his baptism, is anointed as king of not only Israel, but over the whole world. And so clearly, there's nothing wrong with Jesus, the Anointed One, the Christ, walking along, serving the Lord, even if it's on a Sabbath, and picking some grain. He wasn't like harvesting the grain, he was just hungry. And then Jesus sums that all up in verse 27. He said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man," again, that's a title that Jesus often used to refer to himself, "is Lord even of the Sabbath." And so it wasn't that Jesus was breaking God's commands to not work on the Sabbath and taking it holy. Jesus was showing that the Pharisees had minimized the Sabbath by putting these legalistic parameters on it. And so it goes right into chapter 3. Another time when Jesus went into a synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there, Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if Jesus would heal him again on the Sabbath, which again is absurd, right? If someone's hurt or sick, clearly on the Sabbath you can't do those things. It's just nonsense. But again, Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, again, Jesus knows he's stepping on a potential landmine here with the religious leaders, stand up in front of everyone. So Jesus, as he always does, says, oh yeah? You really think you have a better understanding of God than me? Let me show you something. So he says, stand up in front of everyone. Jesus asked them, because again, he knows the thoughts of these religious leaders, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? But they all remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Again, these people should know better, especially the religious leaders. All they do all day long is they pour over God's word. And yet, if they truly understood it, they would see that Jesus was coming back to redeem these true meanings of things like Sabbath. And so sure enough, in front of everyone, to prove a point, he got angry. Again, he was frustrated that these teachers of the law were hindering God's people instead of helping. So he says to the man with the shriveled hand, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Now again, if you had a disability and you couldn't use your hand ever, don't you think people would celebrate the healing when it came? The Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Wow. Here you have this amazing rabbi teaching people amazing things, healing people, and instead of celebrating and getting behind what this Jesus was trying to do for God's people, the Pharisees were so hurt and angry and offended that they began to plot to kill Jesus. Again, this is chapter 3. And yet early on in Mark's story, he needs to point out that the crucifixion of Jesus didn't come about haphazardly, that these religious leaders felt their authority threatened. They felt their power being slipping away. And so what did they do? They attacked the person that they felt threatened their authority. But look at how the crowds responded. Verse 7 of chapter 3. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake. A large crowd from Galilee followed. Again, they want to see something amazing. When they heard all that he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and regions across the Jordan and around the Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told the disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him, for he had healed many so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. So again, his celebrity is building. And so people who know they need help were coming to Jesus in droves. People who had diseases were doing whatever they could to get close to him. And at the same time, the Jewish leaders, those that should get behind what Jesus is doing, were plotting to kill him. And whenever the evil spirits saw him, again, these are demons, as we've been talking about. Angels are real. Demons are real, even if we don't want to admit that. And here these demons that were distracting people from God, whenever they saw Jesus, they fell down and cried, "You are the Son of God." Again, this is still in chapter 3. When people talk about Jesus and they say, "Oh, you know, he was just a nice guy. Oh, he's just so kind. Or he's just such a good teacher." No. Yes, he was all those things. But people tend to forget he's God. He's not just the Son of God, right? God exists in 3 persons. One God existing in 3 persons. And I know that's hard to wrap our mind around. Clearly, centuries have been devoted to trying to explain it. But yet Jesus was God incarnate. Those demons knew exactly who Jesus was. But knowing that people weren't ready to truly hear and see the big picture of who Jesus was, he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. And so in this day an age where we're told to apologize for speaking openly about who Jesus was. Don't be afraid. You're going to get pushed back. You're going to get beat up. But yet there's people in this community and around the world that desperately need to hear who Jesus was and what he did for you and what he did for me. So again, I'm sorry this is a day late. I hope you find it encouraging. And Lord willing, we'll see you next week. Bye.